At 43 years old, I found out my parents had signed over a $4 million estate to my sister and left my name off every single document. No phone call, no conversation, just silence, dressed up as family peace. But 3 years later, on a cold November night, my father showed up at my door, alone, shaking, and holding a manila envelope that would unravel everything my sister had built. But what I discovered 3 days later changed everything. My name is Diane Whitfield. For 22 years, I worked as an ICU nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the kind of job where you learn to read a room in 3 seconds and never let your face show what you're really thinking. That skill served me well long before I ever needed it inside my own family. I lost my husband, Robert, 4 years ago. A heart attack, sudden, no warning, taken from me on a Tuesday morning while he was tying his running shoes. We'd built a quiet life together in a brick colonial on Melrose Avenue, the kind of house with a porch swing and a garden Robert never had the patience for, but loved anyway, because I did. We didn't have children. We had each other. And for 18 years, that had always felt like enough. After Robert died, my parents, Harold and Louise Whitfield, became the center of what family I had left. They lived 2 hours north, on a piece of lakefront property in the small town of Higgins Lake that had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the original cabin with his own hands in 1958. My father expanded it over the decades into a proper house, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound deck, a dock where I learned to fish before I learned to read. Every weekend after Robert passed, I made the drive. Groceries, doctor's appointments, gutter cleaning, the small unglamorous labor of loving aging parents. My father had a minor stroke 5 years ago that left his left hand slightly weakened, and after that, the visits became less optional and more necessary. I didn't mind. I loved my parents, and grief, I learned, needs somewhere to put its hands to work. My sister, Patricia, whom everyone called Trish, lived 40 minutes away in a much larger house in Bloomfield Hills with her husband, Doug Kessler, a man who described himself at parties as in real estate development, though what that meant in practice seemed to shift depending on who was asking. Trish visited less, holidays mostly, and always with expensive gifts and a camera crew's worth of enthusiasm, the kind of presence that photographs beautifully and disappears the moment the shutter closes. I want to be clear, because this isn't a story about a villain born fully formed. Trish wasn't cruel to me growing up. We were close once, in the way sisters are close before life quietly sorts you into different categories. She was always the bright one, the one who filled a room. I was the steady one, the one people called when something needed fixing rather than celebrating. I never resented that division. I told myself it was just who we were. There's a line I still remember my mother saying to me once, back when Robert was still alive, both of us drying dishes at her sink while my father napped in his recliner. She said, "Diane, some daughters are the flowers, and some are the roots. Roots don't get admired, but nothing grows without them." I remember smiling at the time. I didn't yet understand what she was really telling me. For years, that was fine. I didn't need admiration. I needed my parents to be safe, warm, and cared for, and I was the one who made sure of it, quietly, without asking for anything in return. That, I would later learn, was exactly the arrangement my sister and her husband were counting on. It was 2 Thanksgivings ago when the first crack in the silence appeared, and it came, of all places, from a 15-year-old boy who didn't know he was holding a grenade. We were all gathered at my parents' lake house, the smell of turkey and cedar smoke in the air. My father telling his usual story about the winter the dock froze solid enough to drive a truck across it. Trish's son, Connor, was scrolling through his phone at the far end of the table, half listening when he looked up and said, entirely without malice, "Mom, are we going to redo the dock before we move in for real? Or just fix the one Grandpa has now?" The table went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when a child has said something true by accident. Trish laughed too quickly. "Connor, honey, eat your dinner." But I was watching my mother's hands. She had gone very still, the way she used to when she was hiding pain from a doctor, And my father, God love him, kept right on talking about the dock, as if nothing at all had shifted in the air around him. I didn't say anything that night. I want you to understand that about me. I am not a woman who explodes at a dinner table. I was raised to keep my composure, and 22 years in an ICU taught me that panic never solved anything a calm question couldn't solve better. So I waited. I drove home that night with both hands steady on the wheel and a question sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't yet name. 3 weeks later, I got my answer, delivered not by my parents but by my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, who has never in her life been able to keep a secret past the second glass of wine. "You didn't hear it from me," she said over the phone, her voice pitched low like we were doing something illegal. "But your mother told me they finished the estate paperwork. The lake house, the investment accounts Harold built up over the years, all of it. It's going to Trish. 4 million, Diane. Give or take." I sat down on the edge of my bed. I remember the exact texture of the quilt under my palm, the one Robert's mother had made us as a wedding gift. "And me?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. Aunt Carol was quiet for a moment too long. "Your mother said you were already provided for, Robert's life insurance, the house on Melrose. She said Trish has the children, the bigger responsibilities. She said you'd understand." I want to tell you I didn't understand. I want to tell you I hung up the phone and let myself scream into a pillow the way people do in movies. I didn't. I sat very still, the way I used to sit at the bedside of patients whose families had just been told terrible news, absorbing the shock so I could be useful in the next 5 minutes instead of the next 5 hours. But something in me changed that night. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more permanent. A door closing softly somewhere inside me, and a different door, one I hadn't known existed, beginning to open. I didn't confront my parents. I told myself there had to be more to the story, that $4 million doesn't move silently across a family without a reason someone hasn't told me yet. I was right about that. I simply didn't yet know how right. Over the following months, I noticed things I had trained myself not to notice before. My father repeating stories within the same conversation. My mother finishing his sentences a beat too quickly, the way people do when they're covering for someone they love. Small things, the kind of things a daughter who visits every single weekend catches, and a daughter who visits twice a year does not. I also noticed that Trish and Doug had started visiting more. Not weekly like me, but with a new kind of purpose. They arrived with folders, with men in polo shirts who walked the property line with tablets in their hands, nodding at the water frontage, at the acreage, at the old cedar trees my grandfather had planted. "Just getting an appraisal," Trish told me breezily when I asked, over coffee at her enormous kitchen island. "You know how Doug is. Always thinking 5 steps ahead." I smiled and said that was wonderful, and inside, that quiet closing door clicked shut a little further. It was in March, at what should have been an unremarkable Sunday dinner, that the cliffhanger of my old life finally arrived. My father, halfway through a sentence about the boat he wanted to repair for summer, suddenly stopped, looked at me with a strange, searching confusion, and asked, "Diane, sweetheart, when did you and Robert move up here?" Robert had been dead for 4 years. We had never lived at the lake house. My mother's hand shot out and touched his arm, too fast, too practiced, the gesture of someone who had done this exact repair many times before. "He's tired, Diane," she said, not looking at me. Long day. I looked at my father's face, and for the first time, I let myself truly see what I had been half seeing for months. My father was disappearing slowly, and someone in this family had decided that his disappearing was an opportunity rather than a tragedy. I drove home that night and didn't sleep well, and I told myself I would find a quiet way to look closer, without alarming anyone, without accusing anyone of anything I couldn't yet prove. 3 nights later, close enough to 3 years to the week since Trish's name had first appeared on that estate paperwork, someone knocked on my door at 11:40 at night. It was my father, No coat, no car in the driveway, which frightened me more than anything else about the moment. He'd walked nearly a mile in November wind from the gas station where my mother had dropped him for milk and simply lost track of him for 20 minutes. "Diane?" he said, and his voice had a tremor in it I hadn't heard before. "I found something. I don't understand it. I didn't want to ask your mother, she'll worry, but I think I need you to look at this." He held out a manila envelope, soft at the corners, like it had been carried in a coat pocket for days before he found the nerve to bring it to me. Inside were photocopied pages he said he'd found tucked behind a drawer in his old roll-top desk while looking for a fishing license, papers he swore he had never knowingly signed, though a signature that trembled like his sat at the bottom of each one. An authorization letter, a property appraisal with numbers that made my stomach drop, and clipped to the back, a business card for a real estate attorney's office I didn't recognize, and of all things, a torn corner of a glossy brochure with the words Cedar Grove printed across it in soft, reassuring script. "Doug gave me these to sign," my father said, staring at his own hands. "He told me it was insurance paperwork. Diane, I don't remember what any of this means." I sat him down at my kitchen table, made him tea, called my mother to let her know he was safe with me, and told him, as calmly as I have ever said anything in my life, that I was going to find out exactly what these papers meant, and that he had done nothing wrong by bringing them to me. I didn't sleep at all that night. What I discovered 3 days later changed everything. The name on that attorney's business card was the same name that surfaced again 3 days after my father's midnight visit, in an email that was never meant for my eyes. My mother had recently started using a shared family email account for household bills, an account I'd set up for her years ago and still had access to for tech support purposes she never remembered to revoke. One evening, scrolling through it to help her locate a missed insurance payment, I found a message from a real estate attorney's office, addressed to Doug, accidentally CC'd to that shared account instead of Trish's private one. The subject line read, "Lakeview Parcel, closing timeline contingent on guardianship filing." I sat in my kitchen and read it twice, then a third time, my ICU training kicking in. The part of me that learns to read devastating news without flinching so I can act on it clearly. The email outlined a plan. Doug had already lined up a buyer, a development group interested in subdividing the lake property into 6 luxury lots, offering nearly $9 million, more than double what my parents' estate had valued it at. But the sale required clear, uncontested ownership, and clear ownership required my father declared incapacitated, with Trish appointed sole legal guardian and conservator, a filing already quietly drafted and sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting only for the right medical documentation to make it stick. Attached to the email, almost as an afterthought, was a brochure, Cedar Grove Senior Living, glossy photographs of smiling elderly residents in a facility 40 minutes from Bloomfield Hills, and nowhere near the lake and nowhere near me. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the floor of my old life giving way entirely. My father was not simply forgetting things. My father was being positioned, carefully and legally, as an asset to be managed rather than a man to be loved. And my sister, whom I had spent 4 years assuming had simply drifted away out of busyness, had instead been building an exit ramp for our parents straight into a facility. So the lake house that 4 generations of Whitfields had built with their hands could be sold to strangers who would bulldoze it for a subdivision. I did not call Trish. I did not call my mother. I sat with that email until the sun came up, and then I called the one person I knew who could tell me, calmly and precisely, what my rights actually were. Her name is Marjorie Ann Castellano, and she had been my closest friend since nursing school, before she went back for her law degree at 41 and became one of the most respected elder law attorneys in Southeast Michigan. We'd stayed close over the decades, the kind of friendship that survives without needing constant maintenance, and when I called her that morning, my voice steadier than I felt, she listened to the entire story without interrupting once. "Diane," she said when I finished, I need you to hear something clearly, and I need you not to panic when I say it. What you're describing isn't just a family disagreement. Depending on what else is going on, this could be financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That's a legal term, and it matters. What Marjorie explained to me over the following weeks reshaped everything I thought I understood about my own quiet strength. First, she reminded me of something I had genuinely forgotten in the fog of grief and family loyalty. My grandmother, my father's mother, had established an irrevocable family trust back in 1991, long before any current estate planning, specifically protecting the original lake parcel, the 4 acres my grandfather had first built on, separate from the newer additions and investment accounts my father had accumulated later. That original trust had never been dissolved. And buried in a clause almost no one remembered, the successor trustee named to oversee that specific parcel, should Harold ever become incapacitated, was not Trish. It was me. I hadn't asked for that role. I hadn't even remembered it existed until Marjorie pulled the decades-old documents from the county archive and read the clause aloud to me over the phone. My grandmother's careful, old-fashioned legal language protecting a piece of land she'd loved more than she ever fully expressed while alive. Second, Marjorie insisted, gently but firmly, that before anything else happened, my father needed an independent geriatric cognitive assessment, conducted by a neutral physician with no connection to my family, no connection to Trish's attorney, and no connection to me. Not to build a case. To protect him. This isn't about winning, Diane, she told me. This is about making sure nobody, including you, gets to decide your father's fate without real medical truth in the room. I arranged the appointment myself, telling my mother only that I wanted Dad checked for early signs of vascular changes after his stroke history, which was, in its way, entirely true. The assessment took place on a Tuesday morning in April. My father calm and unknowing in a small clinical office, answering questions about the date and the president and a list of 3 words he was asked to remember. The results confirmed early-stage vascular dementia. Real, documented, undeniable, but also, crucially, mild. My father was not, according to the independent physician's written report, currently incapacitated to the degree required for a conservatorship filing. He was a man who needed support, monitoring, and time. Not a guardianship, not a facility, not a rushed sale of the only home he had ever truly loved. I now had 3 things Trish and Doug did not know I had. The forgotten trust naming me protector of the original parcel, an independent medical assessment contradicting the urgency their filing required, and an email, still sitting quietly in an account they had forgotten I could access, laying out a plan that looked less like family concern and more like a calculated liquidation of my father's mind and my grandfather's land. I did not use any of it right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I spent almost 2 weeks simply grieving what I had learned, grieving the sister I thought I still had, grieving the years I had spent believing distance meant nothing more than a busy life rather than a slow, deliberate withdrawal in preparation for something bigger. Marjorie, patient as ever, let me take that time. There's no rush now, she told me. You hold the ground. Take whatever time you need to stand on it. When I was ready, I didn't plan a confrontation. I simply made sure I would be present when the truth revealed itself, because I already knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent 2 decades reading rooms full of frightened families, exactly when that moment would come. It came at Thanksgiving. My mother still insisted on hosting, though Trish had quietly begun suggesting, with increasing frequency, that it might be easier for everyone to gather at her house instead going forward once Mom and Dad were more settled. The lake house dining room was full that year. The same table, the same cedar-paneled walls, my father at the head where he'd sat for 40 years, looking a little thinner than he used to, but present and smiling, and mine to protect. Doug raised his glass sometime after the turkey had been carved, a little too smoothly for a spontaneous toast. We actually have some news, he said, glancing at Trish, who was suddenly very interested in her napkin. We've found Harold and Louise the most wonderful community, Cedar Grove, gorgeous facility, 24-hour care, and it'll let us finally move forward on getting the lake property into better hands. For everyone's peace of mind. My mother's fork trembled slightly against her plate. My father, to his credit, said, "I'm not moving anywhere, Douglas," with a flash of the sharpness that used to run our household, and for a moment I felt a fierce private pride in him. "Dad," Trish said gently, in the voice people use on children and the elderly, "we just want what's safest. The doctor's reports show your memory isn't what it—" "There's only one independent doctor's report," I said. My voice was quiet. I did not raise it. 22 years of ICUS taught me that the quietest voice in a room of panic is the one people actually stop to hear. And I have a copy of it. It says Dad needs support. It does not say he needs a conservatorship. It certainly doesn't say this house needs to be sold to a developer for $9 million before anyone else at this table even knew it was for sale. The room went entirely still, the particular silence of a family realizing the ground has shifted beneath a conversation they thought they controlled. "Diane, that's not—" Trish started. "There's an email," I continued, still calm, still steady, my hands folded on the table in front of me the way I used to fold them beside a hospital bed. "From your attorney's office to Doug, about a closing timeline contingent on a guardianship filing. It was accidentally sent to the account I still administer for Mom. I have it. I have the brochure for Cedar Grove, too, dated 3 months before Dad's memory ever became a topic anyone discussed with me." Doug's face went the color of old paper. My mother turned to my father, her hand finding his under the table in the instinctive way of 45 years of marriage, and I watched her finally understand in real time exactly what her younger daughter and son-in-law had been quietly building around her husband while she stood close enough to smell the smoke and far enough not to see the fire. "And there's one more thing," I said. And this part, I admit, I had waited to say with something that was not quite triumph, but was, perhaps, its quieter, more dignified cousin. Grandma's original trust, the one protecting the first 4 acres, this house, this land, was never dissolved. I'm the named successor trustee, not Trish, me, which means no sale of this parcel happens without my signature, not Doug's buyer, not anyone's. Connor, 15 years old and suddenly looking very young at the far end of the table, said quietly, "Wait, so we're not moving in?" Nobody answered him. My father, for the first time in months, looked entirely, fully present. He looked at me, and something passed between us that no legal document could ever quite capture, and he said simply, "Thank you, Diane." The consequences unfolded not in dramatic courtroom scenes, but in the slow, careful way real consequences usually do. Marjorie helped my parents formally revoke the recent estate changes on the basis of undue influence, supported by the independent medical assessment and the timeline of documents Doug's own attorney had unwittingly provided. Adult Protective Services opened a file, standard procedure once financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is suspected, and while no criminal charges were ultimately filed, Doug's development deal collapsed entirely, the buyer withdrawing once the parcel's protected trust status became public record. Trish and I did not reconcile easily, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending. We spoke eventually in the spring, a difficult conversation over coffee where she cried and said she'd convinced herself she was protecting Mom and Dad from the burden of the house, that Doug had made the sale sound like relief rather than theft. I believe some part of her believed that. I also believe she knew, somewhere beneath the story she told herself, exactly what she was trading our father's dignity for. What mattered more to me, in the end, was Connor. I made sure, quietly, that he understood none of this was his fault, that he'd said nothing wrong at that long-ago Thanksgiving table, that a child noticing the truth is never the villain of a story. I started taking him fishing off that same dock some Saturdays, teaching him what my grandfather taught me. what I intend to teach him for as long as I'm given the chance. My parents still live in the lake house. My father's decline has been slow and gentle, managed now with proper care, a rotation of home health aides I helped select, and Sunday dinners where he still tells the story about the winter the dock froze solid, and I still laugh at it every single time, because some traditions are worth protecting long after the reasons for protecting them have changed. I think often about what my mother told me all those years ago at her kitchen sink, about flowers and roots. She was wrong about one thing. Roots aren't invisible because they lack strength. They're invisible because their strength doesn't need to be seen to hold everything up. I spent years believing my quiet, steady love for my family was worth less than my sister's bright, visible affection. I know now that quiet was never my weakness. It was simply the shape my strength had always taken, waiting patiently for the moment it would be needed. Quiet people don't explode, they clarify. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by real-life themes and experiences commonly found in public online communities. All characters, names, dialogue, and events in this video are fictionalized and created for storytelling purposes, with some elements developed with the assistance of AI. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to real businesses or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. This channel does not claim to depict real individuals or real events. Viewer discretion is advised. We value thoughtful storytelling and appreciate your support.